All right, what is good? Deepak Chona, Sports Med Analytics, bringing you today's NFL injury updates. Thank you very much for joining. Now let's get it popping. Starting with Malik Nabers. So it's almost 2 weeks that he's been out now. And the reports are now saying it's actually due to some mild back tightness. Now, we're a little suspicious that it's truly mild because 2 weeks, 11 days is a relatively long amount of time to be out. With that being said, it's actually reassuring that this is not due to that toe injury. It suggests that the toe is not a lingering issue. And these back tightness issues, they are relatively common. They would be expected to basically fully heal up by the first week of the season. So with 3 weeks still to go, we have a low concern for Malik Nabers having any sort of performance dip or availability concern for week one. We still have to watch this one. A little bit of a bump up in his risk compared to the other wide receivers in that range, but overall, relatively good news. Then Achane. So he sustained a soft tissue strain this weekend. They're saying he's either out for some days or some weeks, but either way, likely ready for week one. So if that's the case, we would still likely see a mild rise in his re-injury risk without usually much of a dip. The fact that it's 3 weeks away to week one and they're saying he would be back, that would imply a low severity strain. So overall, relatively reassuring. Then Justin Jefferson. So he's been out for a while now with a hamstring injury, very likely being pretty conservative with this one, although you certainly would love to get him reps with J.J. McCarthy, a rookie quarterback, or essentially functionally a rookie quarterback. Now, he's being reevaluated this week. If he returns to practice, the data here relates the time missed in preseason week by week to the in-season re-aggravation risk. So given that he would have missed 2 weeks of the preseason, we would expect him to be at about a 10% re-injury risk for the in-season, and now without any real performance dip for week one. All the reports here suggested a mild injury, so overall relatively low concern for the actual season, but we would bump up CeeDee Lamb or Jamar Chase if you're kind of looking for a tiebreaker between the three of them. Then we have A.J. Brown. So he had a hamstring as well. It's a little unclear. Did he have a setback or is it just a slow, gradual ramp up that he's undergoing? He did come back to practice after only 1 week, and that implies a low severity of the original injury here. The overall report suggests a pretty low concern, and in fact, even some reporters saying that they saw him moving around pretty well on the sides during practice. So we suspect that A.J. Brown's going to ramp up this week. If not, we do have to kind of raise at least some yellow flags and look more into it. But otherwise, not any real concern for week one projected. Now, the opposite is true for Matthew Stafford. So there's an update incoming on Monday. This is being recorded on Sunday night. And McVay is reportedly going to talk to the media. And they had mentioned that there was a planned throwing session. He had previously thrown about a week ago, and it didn't really respond the way they wanted. So the question now is, are they going to be able to return Matthew Stafford to practice? The suspicion here is yes. Now, he's played hurt in the past. We would still lean towards him trying to play by week one. The overall concern here is that there's a super high re-aggravation risk because he's had multiple epidurals. He is dealing with a disc issue, probably a herniation. These can be super painful, and they're aggravated with rotation, which is the main motion of a quarterback throwing the ball. So Stafford also is not a mobile quarterback. He's a little bit of a sitting duck in the pocket. So there's a lot of variables here in terms of, is the Rams O-line going to be solid enough to protect him all season long? And all of this raises very high concerns for both Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams, at least on our end. Then Joe Mixon. So unfortunately, as a Texans fan, we're looking not super optimistic about week one for Joe Mixon. He's had an extensive foot and ankle history, including last year, severe high ankle sprain. And then he was seen in a boot in the offseason. He graduated to a brace, which is a good sign. But if they're continuing this non-operative treatment plan for several months now, it becomes a little bit of an unclear endpoint as to, is it getting better? We don't even know the diagnosis, but my suspicion is that it may be related to the high ankle. And if so, might he undergo a tightrope type surgery and basically call it for the season or part of it? Either way, if he's out there, you're expecting a very high re-aggravation risk and probably some limitations in his workload and in-season durability. Then Brandon Aiyuk. So we saw him warming up on Saturday, and the videos actually look super promising. So week 6 was mentioned by Kyle Shanahan as a rough target. That was more or less in line with what the data projects, somewhere around mid-October for him. So it's pretty realistic. The overall projection here is at an 85% efficiency initially. Usage does vary, and the key part of it is going to be what is the status of Jennings, Pearsall, and the rest of the 49ers offense and wide receiver core. Typically, we do see a 4 to 6 game ramp up for wide receivers to get all of their targets and snap count back to normal. Now, the last 6 games of the season for Brandon Aiyuk does project at 90% of his pre-injury level. Keep in mind, this is an ACL and MCL injury, so a little bit slower of recovery than ACL alone. But if you can stash Brandon Aiyuk on your IR and bring him back partway through the season, that may be the optimal use of that spot. Then we have Terry McLaurin, probably not really injured. It sounded like more of a hold-in related to the contract. He is now off the PUP, which is promising because it gives him about 3 weeks to ramp up. And that 3-week ramp up very much lowers his risk of having an early soft tissue injury, hamstrings being the most common. So overall, relatively reassuring on Terry McLaurin if you drafted him. Then Ladd McConkey. So he returned last week. That means he was out for about 2 weeks. And if you factor in the timeline of the return, meaning around week 2 of the preseason, overall we have relatively low concern here. The diagnosis was not released. He did have a sleeve over the leg, which implies maybe a groin, hamstring, or calf type strain. But most of these soft tissue injuries, if you're out 2 weeks and you come back by week 2 of preseason, the data favors about a 5 to 10% in-season aggravation risk, which is pretty low in most cases. So despite not knowing the diagnosis, we are relatively reassured by the data on McConkey. Then Kirk Cousins. Now, I don't think he's washed here. And if you look back to last year, he had a rushed return from his Achilles. Remember, he had late season Achilles the year before, so he was a little bit limited in terms of his push-off strength and his mobility, certainly in the pocket and really all year. And then he was actually doing reasonably well, had a 17-7 touchdown to interception ratio before playing the Saints in Week 10. Then he took a big hit, sprained his elbow, didn't tell anybody about it at the time because he didn't want to lose his job. But he had, after that, the remaining games, a 1 touchdown to 8 INT ratio. And he did lose his job anyway as a result of that. So you have to wonder, does Kirk Cousins still have something left? I very strongly think he does. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him get traded and maybe starting for somebody if there were an injury to happen later on. Then Cam Skattebo. So he's a promising rookie with a potential role here, but he re-aggravated his hamstring now about 2 weeks ago. The average on these re-aggravations typically bumps up the severity to at least a grade 2, and therefore is somewhere around the 4 to 6 week timeline. Now, that the reports are suggesting that week 1 is in doubt. Week 1 would be 5 weeks, so it does kind of make sense. He hasn't really even been doing work on the sidelines. He's just kind of been hanging out and resting. We would suspect a return somewhere in the first 3 games based on those average timelines. But the data here, it projects a very high re-injury risk, 20 to 25%. And usually you see an initial ramp up in volume. So Cam Skattebo may be a little delayed in terms of his real rookie debut. Then you have Taysom Hill. Now this is a potential stash if you have a deep IR league. He's likely going on the PUP. He tore his ACL in December, and the data here favors a late October to early November return. Now, he does have a potentially very valuable role, and the offense is potentially very messy as well. So with that in mind, Taysom Hill, we would consider drafting him and stashing him on the IR only if we have several spots to spare. Then Josh Downs, he strained his hamstring last week. The average on these is 2 to 3 weeks, but the severity varies. It hasn't really been reported yet. If you just look at that average, most players, about 60%, would be able to return by week 1. The overall key here is going to be the time missed, and that's the number one objective predictor of re-injury risk and also tells you about severity. So we're just going to have to watch and wait on Josh Downs here. Then MarShawn Lloyd on Saturday strained his hamstring. He is a high risk player. This is actually his second soft tissue strain this year. He was dealing with a groin earlier, and he had a hamstring history last year. So overall, very questionable on MarShawn Lloyd and probably a player to avoid in most formats. Then Nick Chubb. Now, hard not to root for him, and not just because I'm a Texans fan, but on Saturday, he had 5 carries, 25 yards. He looked solid and nothing kind of remarkable. But if you look at the data here, he had that multi-ligament knee injury, which was his second on the same knee in early 2023, about week 2. And if you look back to where he was at that time, the data strongly suggests that you're going to see an upgrade from where he was last year, closer to where he was in 2023 before the injury. And it says about 85% is what's projected. Now, keep in mind, there's not a lot of guys who have come back from 2 multi-ligament knee injuries on one knee. So durability is heavily in question here. Can he stay healthy all year? That's a hard thing to know, and I don't want to say no, but the knee here is likely arthritic, probably has some degenerative changes, which can easily flare up in season. They probably load manage him a bit, mixing in some Dameon Pierce and some Woody Marks, but Nick Chubb probably gets first crack at lead back, and with that in mind, he probably is looking a lot better than last year. Then Roschon Johnson of the Bears. So he's out with a foot. We have very limited info. Most commonly, you would see the return in the next 1 to 2 weeks. But with this one, again, limited info, so you just have to wait and see. Then Rashee Rice. So big news about the suspension, going to be incoming, hearing somewhere around the end of September. And some reports suggest that he's going to be out for, or the NFL asked for about a half a season worth of game suspension. Now, keeping in mind the injury, he had in October 2024 an LCL and hamstring repair, not an ACL reconstruction. So this is actually projected to be a much faster return to his pre-injury levels. The data here projects about 90% of his pre-injury baseline by week 1. And that's obviously a pretty elite player. He had a recent groin strain that was reportedly a low severity. And if that's the case, then you wouldn't really typically see a further dip contributed to by that groin strain. So overall, promising on Rashee Rice whenever he's on the field, but how you manage that suspension looming without really knowing what it is, that's a little bit more variable. Then Marquise Hollywood-Brown. So he had an ankle injury recently. He's reportedly back to running now. That means we would suspect a return on him this week or next. And with that in mind, Marquise Hollywood-Brown likely coming back. We don't really suspect a super high re-injury risk. He doesn't have a highly concerning ankle history specifically, although he has an accumulation of smaller injuries along the way. So overall, we have to say Marquise Hollywood-Brown might have a decent shot once Rashee Rice is out of the picture. And that's all we got for now. Thank you again for joining, and we will catch you soon.